specifically around 2S LGBTQ plus people, in particular youth and families. So as we go through, if you have any questions, please just put them in the chat. So I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the duration of the presentation. And I welcome any and all questions for clarity or more detail in the chat. Typically speaking, this would be closer to a 4-hour presentation, but obviously because you don't want to spend all day with me, as delightful as I think I am, we want to make sure that you have a more productive day. So we're going to go through this relatively quickly. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Without further ado, let's get started. So first, I do want to recognize that I am on Treaty 6 land. Not everyone obviously is on Treaty 6. We have, I believe, all treaties represented here today. So I do want to start off by just acknowledging that when we do a land acknowledgement, this shouldn't just be a check mark in a box that we do. So whenever we present at altView, we try to bring to that a little bit of a different perspective. So because our presentations are on 2S LGBTQ plus people, it's important for us to acknowledge not just our role as treaty people in general, but as well how that intersects with our work. So when it comes to 2S LGBTQ plus people, we typically come to these sessions with a specific sort of baseline knowledge and sort of understanding and perspective that is inherently colonial. So we have to recognize that here on Turtle Island, there were much more diverse and different perspectives on queer and trans people, and that we have to recognize that as we're doing our work. As well, the altView Foundation likes to not just acknowledge the land that we come from and where we work, but as well what our commitments are in regards to the treaties. So within altView, we have committed to decolonizing our work, so ensuring that our work itself is decolonized to the best of our ability. We as well advocate for our Indigenous relatives. So we have specifically sought out funding to hire on an Indigenous community liaison to do a lot of work within reservations and with Indigenous people. And we as well work and move through the world in a good way. So it's important that as we're doing a land acknowledgement, it's not simply just a check mark that we do, that we also speak to why we do that and what our responsibility is as treaty people. But with that, let's get into a little bit about us. So for those of you who haven't heard of the altView Foundation, we're a nonprofit that began in 2008, specifically in Strathcona County, so where Shore Park is just east of Edmonton. We were formed by a group of youth back in 2008 who had a very similar story. When they grew up, they lived in Strathcona County and they didn't quite feel safe or like they belonged. So they moved into Edmonton because that is a stereotype. That is what most queer and trans people in small towns do when they feel as though they are not understood, not like they belong, and in particular, not safe. So when they met up in Edmonton at various youth groups and programs at U of A, they asked themselves that question: why is that such a stereotype that people leave small communities for larger communities to feel safe and seen? So that was where our organization started from, is from that question. Why is it that queer and trans people will leave their small communities to go elsewhere to feel safe? And can we change that dynamic? So our website's very simply www.altview.ca. And then as well, this is me, and that is an artist rendition of what I look like without glasses. Please do not tell me that that is not true. I like to live in my delusions. I am the executive director of our organization, and I've been a member actually since 2014. So I started off volunteering with our youth groups, which led to a position on our board, which led to an admin position paid, which led to deputy director, which eventually led to executive director. So I always like to remind people that volunteering can get you everywhere. My background is in psychology, sociology, and communications. In university, I did not know what I wanted to do. As it turns out, all the things I took fed directly into this work. So things just sort of turned out the right way. And my big focus is really on presentations and education to really change things from a grassroots level. So we understand that everyone will come to the table with different understandings about queer and trans people. They'll have different attitudes, different beliefs. And it's not our position that we are to tell people what they should and should not believe. It is simply our role to provide the information to the best of our ability and support people through their own learning journeys to whatever destination that is. Hopefully it's towards advocacy and allyship, but it's not our position that we need to judge other people for where they're at or where their learning and understanding is. Just provide them a healthier way to understand. So as we're going through today, if you are relatively new to this topic, that is A-okay. This is specifically designed in a way to invite you in to learn more, to understand, to ask questions and feel comfortable in that space. And if you know, if you have a bit more of a working knowledge, there's a lot of really great tips to take that to the next level. So as we're going through, you may or may not have questions, let me know. And then as well, my contact information is mike@altview.ca. If anything comes up throughout the presentation you want to connect with afterwards. So without further ado, let's get into it. So our agenda today is very simple. We've already done the introduction. We're going to talk some foundational pieces like definitions, terminology, and statistics work. We're going to talk about inclusive language and coming out relatively briefly and what those things are and how we as advocates and supports can be a good bridge and a good support there. And lastly, we'll talk about what we can do specifically in supporting families. So a lot of the questions that we get from people within FCSS is how do we support families? So we have parents coming to us saying their kiddo has just come out. How do we help them? So this is going to hopefully provide you a great foundation to understand what that support can look like. And then of course, we'll always have time for a Q&A, but as I mentioned, if you have any questions, pop them into the chat. So let's get into some terminology really quickly. So when it comes to LGBTQ2S+, what does that acronym even stand for? So ordinarily, I would put, if we were all in the physical space, I'd put you in little groups and we'd have a little group conversation to come back and sort of be energized to talk about what this is. Because it is, of course, on Monday mornings, we'll make sure everyone's sort of energized and working together. But in this instance in an online space, I'll probably just do it for us. So the L is very simply lesbian for women who are attracted to other women. Gay is for men who are attracted to other men, but of course can also be a sort of an umbrella term for the whole community as a whole. We're trying to move away from that because gay men are centered enough as it is. So we're not trying to call it the gay community as much anymore. So B stands for bisexual, which is somebody who is attracted to two or more genders. The T stands for transgender, which simply stands for somebody whose gender identity does not match what they were assigned at birth, which is a really simple way of putting that. And we'll have a visual aid in a moment to actually really visualize what that is and explore that concept in a little bit more greater depth. The Q for some of us may stand for questioning, and for others it may stand for queer. And I'm going to put a pin in that word. So the word queer for many of us may be understood to be pejorative or a slur. And that's completely fair. For many, for a great swath of the last 70 to 80 years, the word queer was used to denote somebody who was different, who was other, who was strange, in particular used against the LGBTQ community to denote them as less than, right? So the word queer is a bit loaded. That said, there has been a movement in the last 15-ish years or so to start removing a lot of the negative connotations from the word. So in many cases where a marginalized community has words used against them as slurs, they will attempt to try to use the word themselves to remove a lot of the negative connotations. So we see a lot of slurs even today in that sort of transitory position. So we can think of some words like in particular words to denigrate the African-American community. We see a lot of those slurs being reclaimed by that community. So that's what we're seeing here with the word queer. So in that instance, when we're using it in a more positive sense, it's usually more academic. So I will be using the word queer throughout the presentation simply to just not to say the acronym every single time. When I do so, it is in that academic sense, which is typically used as an umbrella term. So it's simply to refer to a whole community. And an individual may use it to describe themselves simply to say, we're part of this community, but I'm not really saying specifically where, or they may not even understand specifically where they fit. They're just saying I'm queer as a way of saying I'm part of this community. We don't need to get further details. That said, I would not recommend using the word queer prescriptively. It should never be used to describe somebody else without their consent. We should allow that person to say, I am queer before we use it to describe them. Otherwise, we may inadvertently insult them because like we mentioned, there's a lot of folks who still see that word in a very pejorative slur sense, primarily those who are 30 to 35 and up. So typically speaking, there's a generational shift there where folks who are in their 20s and younger may see the word queer as completely benign, whereas folks sort of my age, like mid 30s and up, will see the word as potentially being quite insulting. So it's best not to use that word specifically for somebody unless they indicate that it is okay for that. And then the 2S simply stands for two-spirit, which to describe is an Indigenous concept. So I will say that I'm not the ideal person to be describing this to. But that said, 2S simply stands for two-spirit, which is an Indigenous concept. Well, it's an English word for an Indigenous concept, which is within Alberta, in our context, largely seen as somebody who has both the male and the female spirit within them, although different communities will have different ways of perceiving this concept. But generally speaking, and this is, again, very general, people who identify as two-spirit will be seen as somebody who has both the male and female spirit within them, but it is a specifically Indigenous concept. So people who are not Indigenous cannot identify as two-spirit because within most Indigenous communities, it isn't simply an identity, it's also a social role. So within many communities, prior to colonization, the Two-Spirit people within their communities would be seen as those with responsibilities beyond others. So it'd be things like mediation, diplomacy, social work, in some cases being judges or being marriage counselors or that sort of thing. So a lot of caretaking of the community and a lot of being sort of the social representative within the community. So within Two-Spirit circles, in a modern sense, we are seeing work to reclaim that identity that was lost through colonization. So when settlers arrived to North America, the Two-Spirit individuals were seen as being aberrant. So a lot of the work of settlements were to remove a lot of the Two-Spirit identities from communities because they were seen as other or different or wrong. So Two-Spirit identities were lost for the better part of the last 500 years, but they're seeing a big resurgence starting in the early 90s. So we're starting to see Two-Spirit people, particularly here in Alberta, identifying much more prevalent within our communities. And what we're seeing is Two-Spirit individuals trying to reclaim those historical cultural roles as social workers, mediators. So within a lot of Two-Spirit organizations, you'll see a lot of that work being done. In particular, one organization I can point to is the Edmonton Two-Spirit Society, which is one of our close partners. And they do a lot of great work within that social work and mediation and counseling field with specifically Two-Spirit individuals. So I'll leave the acronym there for right now. The plus symbol simply denotes that there are many more identities that could be within this acronym, but we don't list them all every time just for the sake of brevity. Wonderful. So here is a visual aid to help us understand some things. So this is what we call the gender unicorn, and it's simply to help us visualize a lot of these concepts in a much more grounded way. So a lot of what we're talking about will be more psychological. So when we're talking today about gender identity, that is the psychological way in which we identify with gender. So gender is what we call a social construct. A social construct is simply something that is only meaningful because we as a society have determined it has meaning. So a very quick example of that would be wealth. If a dog sees a $20 bill on the ground, it does not understand that that represents lunch. So it doesn't necessarily know the value of that $20 bill because we as humans have given that value. So when it comes to wealth, it's simply just something that we have constructed as a society and all determined that that has value and what the rules mean around that. And we relate to that in those terms. So gender is very similar. What does it mean that gender is a social construct? It's simply the answer to the question, what does it mean to be a man and what does it mean to be a woman? So gender simply answers that question. It is distinct from biological sex in that it is primarily psychological and social. Gender identity and gender itself exists within a psychological sphere and a sociological sphere. So it's not necessarily the exact same as biological sex, which is how we have people who are transgender. And that simply means somebody whose gender identity, so their psychological orientation towards gender, does not match what they were assigned at birth based on their biological sex. So very, very simply put, as we grow up, when we're born, we're assigned a gender at birth based on our birth sex. And then as we grow up, our gender identity and our psychological orientation may not necessarily directly align with that. When that happens, we call that transgender. So at what age do we sort of form that gender identity? And this is a piece that oftentimes is controversial, but gender identity can be asserting itself as young as age 3. Typically speaking, gender identity is fully formed by the age of 5 or so, even though youth at that age are very often too young to be able to articulate what that means for them. But through a lot of research, sociologists and psychologists have determined that gender identity is one of those early pillars of self-development of our psychology. So when it comes to gender identity, it often asserts itself quite young. So that's why we see individuals as young as age 3, 4, 5, and 6 coming out as trans and with families supporting them in that journey. So separate from that, but also very related, is gender expression. So this is the manner by which an individual can demonstrate or communicate their gender to others through the way that they exhibit themselves. So whether that is their name, their hair, their makeup, the way they dress, the activities they partake in, the way that they speak, all of those different tools that we use that society gives to us in order to show our gender to others. And the important thing to know there is that society is always changing. So what marks us as male or female in terms of expression can change over time. So the color pink, dresses, high heels, and makeup may today seem very feminine. Over the course of human history, they have been either unisex or masculine. In fact, the color pink was considered masculine only until the turn of the 1900s. So it's really only been in the last 80 to 90 years or so that we've seen the color pink make that transition from being very masculine to being feminine, and vice versa. The color blue was actually seen as being very feminine. So that's why if you look back to old color pictures from the early 1900s, you'll see little baby boys dressed in pink and little baby girls dressed in baby blue. So we see that sort of that gender expression is a sociological tool that changes over time. The other thing to know here is that expression will not always match identity completely. The reason why is twofold. One is access and one is safety. So for many individuals, the gender identity may not match what they're expressing because they're too young, they don't feel safe. In particular, a lot of young gender nonconforming youth will more lean into what is expected of them in order to sort of fly under the radar. So safety is a big concern, as well as just simply finances and access. It can be expensive for many folks to match their gender expression to their identity. So oftentimes they don't have the resources to do that. So when it comes to expression and identity, they may not always match one-to-one. So you can't always judge a book by its cover, which is a pretty, I guess, evergreen phrase because it even applies here. Then as well, we do have sex assigned at birth. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but even sex assigned at birth is not as simple as just male and female. When we talk about biological sex, there is as well a degree of gradients in between. So as we're talking about a lot of these concepts, the important thing to note is that these aren't binary things. They're what we call bimodal spectrum. So that we have two extremes on either end, but then a lot of room in the middle for gray. So a good metaphor for that is that we used to think of gender and sex and orientation as being very binary, very much like a light switch, either on or off, one or the other, male or female, gay or straight. What we're understanding through a lot of research and actually listening to people is that there is a lot more variation, that there's actually, it's more like a dimmer switch where there is still the extremes, the either or at the ends, but then there's a lot of room in the middle for variation. So when it comes to sex assigned at birth, that is also true here. So we have male and female as distinct categories, but we will also have people who fall in that gray zone in between. We call them intersex. Many of us may remember the word hermaphrodite, which is now considered a slur, so we tend not to use it. But the word intersex is now the more modern scientific word for it. The important thing to know there is that that community is not nearly as rare or as small as many may assume. The intersex community is actually about an estimated 1.6% of the global population, which is around the same amount of the population that is naturally ginger, as well as the same percentage of the population who identifies as Jewish. So in terms of the intersex community, it's quite a bit larger than many of us give it credit for. And the reason why we don't hear about it as often is because very frequently people who are intersex don't know, because it's not necessarily as simple as a mix of genitalia. It can be very internal, and therefore individuals may have no idea until they go to conceive and they go to see specialists around hormones or their fertility. So that's when they typically will find out that they have an intersex condition. And then lastly, we have both physical and emotional attractions, which I think are pretty understandable. So we have both physical attraction to people as well as emotional ones, which may differ because we have people who are asexual, where their physical attractions are not the same as their emotional attractions. Any questions on this visual for us? I like to use this slide because I like cute cartoon unicorns, as well as using visual aids to help really understand and land these concepts home. But the important thing to remember here is that all of these things fall on spectrum, so it's not as simple as either or. And as well, each and every one of us have all of these things. So we all fall somewhere in here. We all have a gender identity, the way that we express it. We all have a sex assigned at birth, as well as physical and emotional attractions. Just where we fall on these sliders may differ, but where we differ does not necessarily mark us as less than, is the important thing with this presentation. Oh, thank you, Melody. Wonderful. So if anyone has any specific questions, don't worry, you can pop into the chat and I'll come back to it. So let's look at some statistics. We're going to go through these relatively quickly, and I apologize in advance. These are not always happy stats. So in 2011, EGAL Canada, which is based out of Toronto, did a survey of youth 14 to 18 in schools, and what they found was that 14%, or 1 in 7, had self-identified as LGBTQ. So is this accurate intergenerationally? The answer is no. So one, this is a slightly older survey. We are waiting for the 2021 survey to come out. They do it every decade, so we're kind of a little bit behind. We're waiting for it to come out. It was supposed to be out in February. They haven't done it. I'm assuming it's COVID. So we're waiting for more accurate stats. But even in 2011, we were already seeing that intergenerational difference. So we don't have a slide for it, but the CDC in the US They estimate around 2.5% of their population is LGBTQ, but that takes into account all generations. So when we look at things in an intergenerational sense, the general rule of thumb is that you start at around 12 to 15% for Gen Z. And then as you go up through every successive generation, you knock off about 3 to 5%, generally speaking, until you hit around 1% for the silent generation and boomers. So why is there an intergenerational difference? Very simply, it comes down to social acceptance. So people who are older grew up in societies that were not necessarily as accepting. And so as a result, they don't necessarily have as much of an awareness of self. They don't necessarily have a same degree of freedom to feel that they can be themselves. A lot of those things can intersect with different generations. So as a result, we see the overall population seems quite small, but we're seeing it grow larger and larger every year when it comes to youth. If we're looking in particular at youth 18 to 24, there was a survey that came out actually last month that indicated that it was around 16%, with the number expected to be even higher for those who are under 18. So we're looking at a rapidly increasing population size, not because there are simply more of us, but more because where there's more social acceptance, people feel more safe to be seen. So we're simply just seeing like what happens when we sort of sweep away a lot of the dust covering over people's identities. So we're starting to see more revealed, not necessarily more happening. So again, why could surveys be a challenge in this community? Simply put, self-identification can be a big problem. So there is no objective way to scientifically measure the size or the scope of this community because there's no objective metric. So we rely very heavily on self-identification. The problem with that is, of course, people in denial, people who may not feel safe with the people conducting the survey, a lot of different reasons why folks may not self-identify within a survey. So as a result, our survey numbers can be relatively skewed. The reason why I bring that up is that when you as professionals are reading research around the queer and trans community, I want you to take them with a little grain of salt. Like there's still a lot you can glean from these surveys, but they'll never be 100% accurate because we don't know the size of the community itself. So in many cases, the surveys that we see are indicative of trends, not hard and fast data, just because we're looking at an estimate of a community, not necessarily the pinpoint specific objectives of a community. So as we're going through, I wanted to keep that with a grain of salt, that we specifically sought out surveys that do have great methodology, that we can count on for being much more accurate. So that's also why we keep all of the footnotes in our slides, so you folks can check them out when you get your copy of the slides. So from that survey, a majority of students reported hearing "that's okay" or "you're so gay" from other kids at the school often or all the time. So when we say "that's so gay," it's typically not to denote that something that is good. Typically, we're saying something is bad. And the majority of students reported hearing that. So when we think about how that would make them feel, of course, we understand through internalization that when we're steeped in a community attitude, whether or not it's intentional, it can be simply just incidental. As we're steeped in that cultural attitude long enough, we start to adopt those attitudes over time. So when it comes to homophobic and transphobic language within a space, over the course of their time within schools, youth in those more phobic environments will start to pick up those attitudes that they're different, they're less than, they aren't good enough, they are to be made fun of, they're lowest on the pecking order. And it's not just those queer and trans students, it's also their peers pick up those attitudes as well. So it makes them less safe. So as we go through these slides, sort of keep that in the back of your mind that as we're thinking of what we allow in our spaces, it does lead directly to a destabilization of mental health, of sense of self, self-esteem, those sorts of things. So we as well have a study from SARAVYC, which stands for Strength and Resiliency Amongst Vulnerable Youth Center. It's an offshoot of UBC. They did a survey specifically of just trans and non-binary people from across the country. But they did also make that survey searchable by region as well as age. So these stats are specific to Alberta and specific to those trans and non-binary people who responded, who are 14 to 18. The reason why I point that out is because that does make the sample size quite small. It's about 114 or so. So I don't want to say that these numbers are hard and fast absolutes, simply just that this is indicative of a trend that we're seeing here in Alberta. I thought that those local numbers are more useful for us. So 41% of those youth had attempted suicide at least once in the previous year. 2/3 didn't seek out mental health help when they knew they needed it. And 91%, it was because they didn't want their parents to find out, which I think is the really important stat there, is that the majority of those kiddos knew that they needed mental health help. And the vast overwhelming majority of the reason why they didn't was because they didn't want their families to know. So 85% rated their mental health as fair or poor in a 5-point scale. So the next one up was neutral. So 85% rated themselves in the lowest 40% of mental health outcomes. And then lastly, this one is worded a little bit strange, but 1/3 of all surveyed lived their felt gender identity at all times, and that was a factor connected with better mental health. So what that simply refers to is social transition. So we didn't touch on it before, but trans people can do what we call transition. And there's two different modes of that. One is medical transition, which is the one we often think of with hormones, surgeries, those sorts of things. But then the other component is the social transition, which is more modifying their gender expression in ways that they can live and be seen as their felt gender identity at all times. So they're changing their pronouns, changing their names, their style of dress, that sort of thing. And that was linked with better mental health. So there's two things I want to point out with that. One is that when people are able to authentically live as themselves in a safe environment, that is very much linked to better mental health, which I think makes sense to us. And as well, this is also kind of a hidden happy story in that 1/3 of these kiddos have safety within their home and school environments to be able to be themselves, which I think should be encouraging. We're seeing more and more acceptance. And as we do, we're seeing those mental health outcomes become more positive. So over the course of time, as we're gaining more acceptance for our trans kiddos and they're able to be themselves safely, they're seeing the dividends when it comes to their mental health and their feelings of safety. So does anyone have any questions about these stats? Is there anything that sticks out to us and we want to pause on and delve into more deeply? I'll give it a second for the chat. Because these stats can be pretty heavy, and we do have whole workbooks of more studies that we could show, but we try to keep it relatively restrained. The general idea here is that we have to understand that the queer and trans community experiences discrimination, but that discrimination is not necessarily universal. So different demographics within this community may experience things at different rates. Particularly speaking, our trans siblings within the community experience discrimination at much higher rates, as well as violence and risk of safety at much, much higher rates. And of course, that goes up the more intersections that we see with trans women of color being specifically the group within the overall queer and trans community that suffers the most. So when we're looking at this community, it's best to see it as a monolith, that different people will experience discrimination very differently. For instance, we now see, in particular, young gay boys experiencing very little discrimination, still discrimination to be sure, but in terms of the overall community, relatively less than their trans and non-binary peers. So we definitely are seeing sort of differentiation when it comes to discrimination within our communities, and particularly within our schools too. All right, no questions, so let's move on to the next piece, which is inclusive language. I know this is a piece, oh, wait, there is a question. I mentioned that the data was from Alberta. Does it reflect specific areas within the province or major cities? It actually was a good mix of urban and rural, to my understanding, with a bit of a skew towards urban. So I think it was predominantly from Edmonton, Calgary, and Red Deer, but there was representation from, I think it was like 27% was rural. So still fairly significant. Obviously, with a sample size of only about 114, that isn't an ideal spread. So we are going to say that it's not as absolute as it is indicative of trends. But thank you for the question. So looking at inclusive language, language is like a weather vane. So it reflects the current conditions of our environment. When we normalize disrespectful language, even if it's incidental or unintentional, it's a sign of how tolerant that environment is. Because very often we hear people say things like, well, they didn't really mean it. That's not really what they meant, or it was just a joke. But the reality is that even when that's true, even if the disrespect is unintentional or not necessarily the point of what's being said, it still adds up. It's sort of like the individual snowflakes that build to a blanket of snow. So queer and trans people tend to be very sensitive about language choices, largely gendered assumptions. So the words boyfriend and girlfriend versus partner, pronoun assumptions, those sorts of things. So as queer and trans people are in environments, we don't often know who's safe and who's not. So more often than not, we rely heavily on the verbal communication. So if people are sort of using inclusive language, they're in sort of impeding others from using harmful language, or they're trying to educate others. it's typically seen as a really good sign of safety. So when we see somebody say, hey, don't say gay that way, that's really rude, then that to us is a very good signifier of, oh, that person gets it, that person is safe. So as a result, queer and trans people tend to be outsized. They have an outsized awareness of language and language being used in space. And that sensitivity is really important when understanding what barriers may exist for the, queer and trans kiddos who are accessing supports. So when we don't see language that reflects our safety, we tend not to feel safe. And that is just, we err on the side of caution as well. So it's not even just specifically, well, that person said something homophobic, so they're not safe. It can also simply be that person was neutral in the face of homophobia, so therefore they're not safe. So whenever there is a question or a doubt, we will typically err on the side of caution, particularly our youth. So that's why we see within school environments, when there is a teacher, guidance counselor, or school staff member who is particularly more safe and is sort of known as the safe person, they tend to become a lightning rod for all of the queer and trans kiddos within that school. So within our school environments, we probably all know who that teacher is. We all interact with them. And that person tends to be seen as the safe person to go to. So when it comes to inclusive language, here are some really easy tips. So normalize pronoun usage and sharing pronouns. So we see some people within the Zoom call today having their pronouns within their usernames, which is wonderful. In some cases, we can share our pronouns when we're introducing ourselves. So I could have opened the session today by saying, good morning, everyone. My name is Michael. My pronouns are he and him. Sort of using that opportunity to introduce ourselves, maybe when we're introducing ourselves to a group, saying, hello, my name is blank. My pronouns are blank, blank. Consider changing our habitual language to include more gender neutral words such as they, partner, and folks. This is very, very challenging. So the one thing I want to point out here is that habitual language is really hard to change, particularly the older we get. So that's the reason why we see very young kiddos. We often hear of like elementary age kiddos just being very adaptive. So a youth comes out and is trans within an elementary school, and they are changing their pronouns. The other kids in the class, 9 times out of 10, will adapt that language change within the day, whereas adults in the space may take a while. So it's because our habitual language cements itself over the course of our lifetime. So the older that we get, the harder it is to change that reflexive language. For instance, my big stumbling block was saying, hey guys. Hey guys was basically what I said all the time. I used to work within restaurants and hotels. So hey guys was how I introduced myself to pretty much everyone I spoke to. So it became really hard to change that. It took a lot of time and I'm still working on it. So the reason why I point that out here is because I literally do this for a living. So if I have to forgive myself for taking my time to change the habitual language, I think that we can all forgive each other for trying and it taking a long time. So using those gender neutral words can take a lot of practice, but I do encourage you to try because that practice can pay a lot of dividends when it comes to demonstrating your support and your safety. So it's important not to judge a book by its cover. Like I mentioned before, someone's gender expression may not match their identity. So just because someone looks masculine does not mean that they will inherently be using he, him pronouns. So it's best not to judge a book by its cover and assume. And we do have a question in the chat. So do I have any suggestions for how to make groups more inclusive for group names? For example, we have boy and girl after school programs, and we separate them because the topics that are explored. Wonderful. So the important thing to note here is that I think it's okay. We can still have those gendered spaces as long as we make space for trans boys and girls. So if in the boy spaces, we allow trans boys and in the girl spaces, we allow trans girls, that's typically okay. For instance, I did some work with Families First in Fort Saskatchewan, and they had a program called Dad Ventures, specifically to support the fathers of young families to aid in the bonding process and help encourage dads to be more active and sort of active within the nurturing zone of parenting. And they consulted with me on whether or not that was trans exclusive. And then I simply said, I think the title is fine because there's plenty of trans people who identify as dads. So that's okay. As long as we within the description say that trans individuals, non-binary people are welcome in these programs, that's okay. It's okay to say, like, I don't want to say that gendered language is inherently bad. We can still use words like wife and husband, as long as we're not using them for other people without their consent, because some people don't have wives or husbands, right? So ensuring that we just don't make that assumption is what I always try to do. And we can, especially with our programs, in the description say who's welcome and why. That's usually how I recommend it, because having boy and girl spaces isn't a bad thing. I don't want that to be the takeaway, is that using gendered language is bad. It's very useful and there's no problem with it. It's more of just how we're using it, and whether it is exclusionary. So typically speaking, we can look at the wording of programs. Like for instance, we have boys and girls clubs all across Alberta, and they accept non-binary people who are neither boys nor girls. So even though they have gendered language in their titles, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are exclusive in terms of programming. So that's typically how I would recommend and talk about that. So when we make a mistake, don't make a scene. This is very important as well, simply because when we make, oh, you're welcome. When we make a scene, what we're doing is we're placing a spotlight on that person and then making it about us being sorry. So for instance, if we misgender somebody, so say they use she, her pronouns, but we say he, him by accident, we may have the impulse to say, oh gosh, I am so sorry. I swear I took this amazing training course from Michael. He taught me everything I need to know. I'm so sorry I forgot everything I knew. I must have insulted you so much. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. What you're doing is you're making a big moment that's more about that person making you feel okay. So very simply just say, oh, I apologize. I messed up. I'm not going to do that mistake again. It's very simply like you acknowledge the mistake and commit to changing. You don't have to make it a big deal, because placing a spotlight on that person to make yourself feel better is going to make that person feel very awkward, particularly if they have issues feeling comfortable in spaces. You're just going to make that worse. And then lastly, support others in learning. So if you notice somebody else using language that is a little bit either outdated, insulting, disrespectful, or they're using the wrong pronouns for somebody, just correcting them in a very open way, not necessarily saying, you're an idiot, don't do that, but just simply inviting them in and saying, hey, did you actually know that that person's pronouns are she and her actually? Like, and inviting them in and just like, hey, I trust that you're a good person. Like, let's just like make this quiet thing and we just change. So that way you're encouraging that person to learn without making them feel condemned, because 9 times out of 10, you make someone feel condemned and they're going to get defensive and they're going to double down on whatever they were saying before. So it's always important to support people in learning, challenge them to learn, not confront them and embarrass them into learning. So let's talk about coming out. So coming out is the process by which an individual discloses their sexual orientation and or their gender identity. The reason why I use pictures of an onion, and I do have to change this because it became a meme, because Shrek came back and ogres have layers and so do onions. It's a whole thing. So we had to get a new picture, because whenever we use this picture, kids laugh at us, so we have to change it. But the reason why we use a picture of an onion is because we think it's a very good visualization. The innermost piece of the onion, if we use this metaphor, that's like the person you feel safest with. So coming out would typically involve speaking to that person or people and disclosing to them who you are. So sharing to them a piece of yourself. And then as that conversation goes well, you would move out the layers of safety. So we all sort of have a hierarchy within our heads of who we feel closest to, who we feel safest with, who we trust the most. And that's a visual representation of this. So the opposite of coming out is being outed. And that's when we disclose someone's sexual orientation or gender identity without their consent. So what that does, it takes them from that innermost piece of the onion and pulls them all the way to the outside before they're ready. So it's very disorienting, very disruptive, and in many cases, very dangerous, because that person is now potentially at risk, whether in the home, whether just at risk of their own mental unwellness. You're putting them at greater risk. The question here becomes, can we out somebody if it is to help them? And then the answer to that is maybe in a very rare instance, but more often than not, and this is the vast majority of cases, if, for instance, we know that a youth is self-harming as a result of anxiety and stress due to discrimination around their gender identity or their sexual orientation that they haven't disclosed to their parents, we can disclose to their parents the harmful behavior, the self-harm, without necessarily having to out the youth in order to do that. So that way we aren't creating a secondary problem that can destabilize our relationship and ability to be able to help them. So if we inadvertently out them to their parents or their family or what have you, in order to help with the self-harm issue, for instance, what we're doing is that kiddo is now focused exclusively on the being outed. They're worried about what their parents think of them. They're now thinking about your relationship to them in a very different way, which might jeopardize that relationship completely. We're really creating a secondary issue that they're going to be focusing on rather than the much more prioritized issue, which is their self-harm. So being able to inform home and disclose around the self-harm issue, and then recommend various supports and services that could help with that. And if the youth comes out through that process, and that's okay, but we don't want to create that secondary issue that distracts from the primary issue, which is the self-harm. So that's why we always differentiate between coming out and being outed, because coming out is somebody controlling their own story and their own circumstances, the hows, the wheres, the whos, and the whens, whereas outing is the opposite. It's where all of that control is taken from them. And as we know, when people's trust and feeling of control is violated, they often shut down in many ways. So we're not actually encouraging them to be healthy when we out them. It actually can endanger them further. So that said, as we go into the next slide, it's more about what we can do when someone comes out to us. And if any of you have had someone come out to you before, hopefully you see the things that you did on this list. And if you didn't, do not worry. I'm sure you did a great job and that person is very well supported. This is more of a list of things that we could consider, and they're not always applicable. So first and foremost, recognizing the trust implicit in the act, that person is trusting you with a lot. And it's important to recognize that and honor that. Listening without judgment or applying our own perspective. So we may have, as I mentioned at the top, have our own perspectives when we come to the table when it comes to queer and trans people, but that moment's not about your perspective, it's about what their needs are. Ask what their identity means for them. This can be a very helpful way to get a window into what their experiences are like. And in some cases, when it comes to youth, they may be coming out in ways in which we don't understand what they mean. So they may be either using words that we don't recognize, because every single day there's a different identity coming out of the woodwork. Even I can't keep up with it half of the time, because kiddos have a lot of new words to really signify different experiences and different ways of being. So different people will come out with different terminology, and oftentimes ask what their identity means for them is a great way of understanding what their experiences might be like. And as a little byproduct as well, it helps ground them in a conversation that's about their experiences, and it shows you giving them open-ended questions in order to demonstrate that you care and you're trying to learn more. So ask questions that are appropriate for your relationship. Don't be invasive. This is important. I think that with this particular group of people that I'm speaking to today, you already understand professional boundaries, so I don't think you would be invasive. But it's important to note that asking questions about things happening in the bedroom or things happening in the pants, probably pretty invasive and not going to be super great. So don't ask, well, have you had the surgery yet? Or who's the wife? Don't do that. It's pretty important to not be overly invasive when we're having these conversations. If you had suspicions, keep it to yourself. This is for two reasons. One, as I mentioned earlier, people may modify their gender expression in order to keep themselves safe, or to at least perceive themselves as safe. And when you say that everyone had suspicions, what you're really validating for them is that no matter what they did to keep themselves safe, it was all for nothing. And then more often than not, particularly for youth, if you say that to them, their very next thought's going to be, oh my gosh, if this person knows, who else knows? And then in the worst case scenario, the person that knows is the person that we want to know the absolute least. So even though we often don't say, I kind of suspected, but we cared about you anyway, we still respect you. We never say that in ways that are inherently negative. We actually do mean it to be supportive, but it's not always interpreted that way. And that's why I bring up the second one, which is that when we say the phrase, we all kind of knew, but we respected or loved you anyway. The word anyway is doing a lot of work there. So what a lot of people interpret that as is, this is a problem you had to overcome just to see me as an equal, or just to still see me as a person worthy of your love and respect. So it's really interesting that phrase, we all kind of knew, but we didn't care, is always delivered in a way that's typically very positive and supportive. But at its heart, it can be very destabilizing. So it's important not to bring that up, because during the coming out conversation, that individual might get very emotional, potentially even unexpectedly so. And when we're speaking to them, their nerves, their fears, their anxiety, that's the lens they're going to be receiving all of our language through. So if we're trying to be supportive, we have to understand the degree of heightened anxiety they may be feeling. Ooh, and Kathleen, I think you had a question.
So I was going to write it, but it was taking too long.
You got it.
So I have a student that gave me their pronouns in class. I'm just going to, if I say this wrong, let me know. Mm-hmm. And then we were calling them their preferred pronouns because that's what they wanted me to call she, her in our GSA. Mm-hmm. But when I go into their class, they want he and him because they don't want the students to know. And then I read that saying preferred pronouns is offensive because preferred is like they have a choice. So what do I say?
So we typically, so preferred pronouns isn't the worst thing in the world, but we are trying to move away from it because it does indicate like I have a preference. Like our gender is not necessarily a preference. It's just who we are. But it's not necessarily offensive. Offensive is sort of, we're moving away from it. And when it comes to individuals who are out in some spaces but not in others, it's important to always consult with them what their safety needs are. So that actually comes up in a moment, but it's important that we sort of get a sense for what their needs are. So if they're safe in one space, but they don't feel comfortable in another, then it's usually on us to be able to support them in being as safe as they can be. So in many cases, that means using the pronouns they want in private, and then sort of using the ones that everyone expects or is used to using in public until they're in a position to be able to be out in and safe in all spaces. So we often do see that, particularly within GSAs where kiddos will use different pronouns. We actually have a community GSA in Fort Saskatchewan where we have a youth who is only out at our community GSA and is not even out at school. So they're out just with us. So and some of our volunteers for that program also work within their school. So they have to balance that as well, where they know that within the school, that student goes by he, him, but then in our community GSA, it goes by she, her. So we often have to bridge that gap a little bit and help them to get into a position where they are safe to be themselves. In some cases, those kiddos will never feel safe within their home community and they won't come out until they're away. So we often have to straddle that line for quite some time. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. I just, because the teachers were asking me, some of the teachers have come to the GSA now to learn, and then they saw that their pronouns were different and in this space. So can I say they? Like when the teacher was like, oh, okay, I noticed so-and-so's pronouns are she, her here, but in class it's he, him. Can I say, well, they prefer in this space, she, her? Or do I say the student prefers in this?
You could just say the student prefers, or even just use like the GSA pronouns in that instance, but like in public, say, in another instance, I would use the pronouns that the family would know, sort of like the ones assigned at birth, just because we're trying to keep that kiddo safe.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
No problem. So don't give unsolicited advice or use the moment to spark a debate. So similarly, that moment's at the time to say, is that identity really real though? I don't think that really exists. It's not a moment to spark a debate. Their identity is not a debate. Even if it potentially could be debatable, it's just not. It's because they're in a position of vulnerability. So even if there is a potential debate there usually isn't. But even if there were, that moment is more about them and their vulnerability and their needs, not necessarily about being correct or being absolutely 100% objectively right about something. So this is the one that I think Kathleen will apply. So if they are telling only you or ask if they're planning to tell others, so this is really important. So if they're telling only you, then you know not to out them to others. If they're planning on telling others, then you can potentially be a mediator or someone to help support that or facilitate that. Or even if that's not appropriate, you can potentially be the person to do the wraparound afterwards. So sort of following up and saying, hey, how did that go? I know you were coming out to your parents this weekend. How did it go for you? Is there any support that I can offer? Provide them some resources, just a space to vent, that really great wraparound service. But again, this is also where you would safety plan with them. So if they're only telling you, I would recommend safety planning in that moment. So even saying, well, that's wonderful. How can we help you navigate this space? So if it's happening in a school environment, saying, what pronouns would you like me to use around other people? Do you want me to correct people, or do you want me to just allow them to be wrong and you and I know what the difference is until you're ready? Or how do you want that to look? Always allowing them to set that tone because they know their safety best. And then lastly, and probably most important, treat them the exact same. So it's important to note that individuals don't really change after coming out, although you may see a different side of them. That's really more them revealing what they couldn't or maybe didn't feel safe to do before. So you're seeing a little bit more of their true selves. And I will say that the number one thing that most queer and trans people, particularly youth, fear before coming out is that their relationships will change, that their situation will change well beyond their control. So they may come out and people may see them differently, treat them differently. So it's important to note that that is a common big fear. So the more that you can maintain continuity of how they experience the world, the more safe and secure and supported they're going to feel. Because no one enjoys being treated differently or feeling like revealing ourselves is going to result in being treated differently. Wonderful. Let's move on to a very brief conversation about inclusion, generally speaking. So from the same department at UBC that did the earlier SARAVYC study, they also looked at inclusive schools in a much more specific way. So what they did was they studied 300 schools that had queer and trans inclusive policies. So that would include things like gender neutral washrooms, GSAs, lesson plans, they celebrated Pride, any of those different inclusion initiatives. And they followed another 300 schools that did none of those things. So what they found at the end of 3 years was that the odds of suicidal thoughts and attempts for gay and bisexual boys were more than 70% lower. And for lesbian and bisexual girls, it was about 2/3 lower. And as well, heterosexual boys dropped by about 27%, which was a bit of a surprise. They were more of a control group. But what we realized afterwards is that the way that heterosexual boys in general are bullied is very much along gendered lines. So in spaces where being gay or being feminine isn't a bad thing, a lot of those insults don't have much to stick on. So even heterosexual boys saw a significant improvement to their overall mental wellness that impacted things like suicidality. So as we're creating those inclusive schools, it's important to note that there is benefits beyond what some people say is one small community, because at the end of the day, even if it is only 2% of the population, that 2% still matters. But as well, there are many people who are bullied under the presumption that they're gay or trans. And there are people who are bullied because they have queer and trans loved ones or best friends or parents or what have you. So it's important to note that inclusion does impact people well beyond sort of the target demographic. That same study also looked at inclusive environments that have similar positive benefits beyond just suicide rates. So chemical dependency drops, grades and engagement go up. And in many cases, the costs in a school go down because of less strain on health services and supports. So the question becomes, what lessons can we learn within schools that can be applied to the general community at large? And I think that that's simply that the more inclusive and safe we are, the more people have less to worry about. So things like mental wellness improves, chemical dependency drops, and people want to be engaged. They actually want to do things. So it's really hard to want to be valedictorian or captain of a football team if that brings you scrutiny or if that will bring more attention, which for most people, when we feel unsafe, we don't want that scrutiny or attention. So that even doubles for adults as well. So we have a lot of people within our communities who are queer and trans, but maybe aren't very open about it or aren't necessarily as forward about it in the community because they're worried about blowback. So when we're thinking about inclusion, we can think about all the ways in which it impacts the community well beyond schools. And we had a question from Eugenia in the chat. Does altView still run the community GSA in Leduc in person on the last Monday of the month at the library? Not during COVID, so we have not in a little over a year. So Sophie, who is our Director of Community Supports, will still be supporting that when we can. But for the time being, we haven't been able to support just because we can't be there physically in person. Wonderful. So to round us out, we're going to talk about what we can do. And this is specific to how we can support families. So we only have a couple minutes, so I want to get through it pretty quick. So we have critical protective factors. What these are things that impact not just the wellness of a kiddo, but as well can also reverse prior damage. So what we're looking at here is reducing just not the future outcomes, but also reversing some of the damage that's been done in the past. So key protective factors for queer and trans youth is family connectedness, caring teachers, safer schools, and other caring adults. We already kind of went through the other pieces. What I want to touch on here is family connectedness, as many of us are supporting families. Oh, and Joanna has their hand raised up.
Hi, I just had a question about two-spirit. That concept is fairly new to me. So I was just, I understand that it's specific to Indigenous, but what if you had a kid who wasn't Indigenous and they said that I relate to that? What would you say to them?
So what you could say is that there are other identities within the queer and trans umbrella which would apply, but because they're not Indigenous, they may be able to relate to some of the concept, but they can't adopt the social role, and which is piece baked into that concept. So we can't remove the social connotations from it. So because they're not Indigenous, they can't adopt those social roles, but there are still ways of being gender diverse or they're non-conforming or trans in ways that may reflect how they feel without necessarily appropriating what is true for Two-Spirit people within Indigenous cultures, if that makes sense.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome. I think that we did have a question in the chat as well that I'll go back to. So my apologies, I'm just scrolling back in the chat. So we had a question. We are looking to include a book in our Pride-themed Family Fun Night kit in June. Do you have any recommendations for books that would be suitable for families with children of all ages? Or your go-to websites for resources that I may explore? So what I will do actually, so I always do a wraparound email afterwards. I do have a list of books potentially. So what I'll do is I'll include that in that email rather than list them here. But I will make sure that's part of the email that goes back to Melissa to go out to all of you. So let's talk about critical protective factors. Wonderful. So we're going to talk about family connectedness to round this out today. So the first thing to understand is affirming conversations. So open, affirming, and consistent conversations with queer and trans youth about their identities is a key element in harm reduction, and encouraging families to engage in this is really helpful. So creating an environment where 2S LGBTQ+ identities can be discussed openly and positively reduces feelings of shame in queer and trans kiddos. It encourages healthy development of self, open dialogue within the home, and as well normalizes support for 2S LGBTQ+ people. It's important that we note that when we affirm and we are very open and nothing is taboo, the more we're sending the message that this is normal, you're completely fine, and there's nothing to be ashamed of. Because shame, typically speaking, is that foundational piece. It's shame and fear in equal measure tend to sort of form the foundation of that mental unwellness that we speak of. So reducing feelings of shame goes a long way to sort of course correcting a lot of those mental health outcomes. So looking at queer and trans spaces and events, so taking kiddos to spaces, programs, and events for 2S LGBTQ+ people connects them to a wider community. So support in the family is super important, but it can't fill every role. So community connection and care remains very vital because it can be transformative to learn from peers who understand your experiences on a very personal level. So it's important that we have access to people who have gone through the same things as us. So as much as having supports is important, learning from people who have actually gone through this, just like we did, is really important as well. It's also important to remember that being able to exist in a space where you don't have to defend or explain who you are is very healthy. So you don't have to bear the burden of scrutiny or having to say, this is who I am, and this is the definition of what that means. Like it can be very exhausting to always have to either defend yourself or explain who you are. So being in spaces where you don't have to is a place where you can lay down your burdens and just be, which is very important. So looking at queer and trans role models. So in addition to 2S LGBTQ+ spaces, access to queer and trans adult role models and mentors can be exceptionally helpful. The reason why is because being able to envision a healthy future is very vital in healthy development. For instance, having that queer adult role model means, oh, I can go into a job field like this, or I can be like this. When we don't have those role models, it's really hard to embody. When we don't have someone who embodies a healthy future, it's hard to really understand and orient ourselves towards meeting that future. So having someone who does can provide guidance and answers to questions that the youth may not have access to answers to otherwise. The internet is very, very helpful, but it is very inconsistent. So be able to ask questions, particularly ones that are a little bit more personal or embarrassing, like what does this feel like? What is this like? Having the access to a person who will answer your questions safely is a really, really powerful thing. So being able to actually learn from someone who's gone through things that you'll be going through is a great way of finding support. And then looking at affirming faith communities. So it's important to note that queer and trans people are not less religious than others. We simply have a very complicated relationship with churches and religious institutions in specific. But queer and trans youth connected to affirming communities benefit from those communities, and affirming faith communities are a key example. So where we can create affirming communities from existing faith communities, and failing that, seeking out faith communities that are affirming might be necessary. So we receive a great deal of support and connections as a community from our religious institutions, from our faith communities, and queer and trans folks need that as well. So finding a faith community that works for a whole family will go a long way to helping to build and maintain a perception of family support. So when we find places where we can still feel validated within our faith, as well as feel safe as ourselves, can be very transformative. Not always possible in every community, but wherever we can, affirming faith communities are very powerful. And then lastly, belief in a happy future. So queer and trans kiddos are able to picture happy futures for themselves It's critical towards reaching that future. And that belief starts with the adults around them, particularly with the family. So if a parent does not believe their 2S LGBTQ plus kiddo can have a happy future, that belief will absolutely be perceived by that child. So families need to model that belief in a happy future in both words and actions. So it's important to note that when it comes to our families, if they're reflecting to us that they don't believe that we're going to be able to be happy, then why would we try to be happy? Our own parents don't think we're going to be happy, so why would we even try? So it's important that we still validate that there may be safety concerns around discrimination, but that shouldn't necessarily indicate that individual can't still be happy. So just because we face discrimination does not mean we're incapable of happiness. In fact, we're very capable of it, and we strive for it whenever we can. So we should really try to underline that believing that they can be happy is a great way of role modeling and inspiring them to go out and actually achieve happiness. So I'll leave you with a rhetorical question of what will you do? Hopefully you'll go out and continue your learning. You'll continue to support and be advocates in your community. But lastly, to wrap off, I know that we are a little bit over, but does anyone have any questions while we are finishing up? As well, if you do have any questions you want to follow up with me specifically, you can simply email it info@altview.ca. As well, I think we just saw a question. Wonderful. I did see more of a private question. So for those two, so we have one. So how do we start a GSA in our small community? So that might be more of a email conversation, but what I will say is that partnering with a library is typically very helpful. If you want any specific recommendations around starting a GSA, I might actually put that in the email as well with the book list. Yeah, that's probably what I'll do. And then there was another question that I will email to directly. Wonderful. I'm just going to copy that. Yeah, so there's a private question here as well that I will reach out to you specifically outside of this. Otherwise, folks, if there's any other questions in the last minute before I hop off, that would be wonderful. Oh, you're welcome for all the great information. Okay, I'm not seeing any specific questions. Hopefully this was very informative. Melissa will be sending out these slides as well. If you have any specific questions for me, you can feel free to reach out to me directly. With that, I will leave you all in the wonderful hands of Melissa. Have a wonderful day, folks. And hopefully I see more of you in the future.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was really such important information for everyone. And I encourage everyone who wants more information to reach out to Mike and AltView. They have wonderful presentations and can do longer sessions if you need that for your community. So thank you so much, Mike. Have a wonderful day. Don't get blown away.
I'll try not to. All right, everyone, take care.
For those of you who want to stay on for the sharing session, please stay on the line, and I will turn it over to Amanda and Lisa to start facilitating the monthly sharing session.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Melissa. Well, good morning, guys. I hope everybody enjoyed that as much as I did. I thought that was excellent information that Mike shared with us. Does anybody have anything that they would like to start off our sharing session with? I'm having a hard time getting my screen back to normal. And how have you guys, has anybody been doing any online programming? I want to start off with that question.
Hi there. So yeah, I work with FCSS over in Sylvan Lake at the Flipside Youth Center. And over this last month, we've been doing just some online programming for children aged 6 to 11. And I don't really know how to gauge how it's going. I mean, it's going well with the amount of kids who are showing up. And it's only like, I want to say 6 kids that come on a semi-regular kind of rotating basis. but we've been doing such activities as game nights. Those seem to be our most popular events on our Tuesdays, where we pick a video game and we all just play it together. Among Us does really well with that. Roblox does really well with that as well. I find those games that don't really cost anything to buy and to be able to play, those free to play games tend to work best. And also games that are a little bit more on the simple side, because I've been finding other activities that we do that involve kids having to, well, read first of all, since a lot of them are too young to be able to fluidly read. A lot of the time there's a lot of difficulty there because they don't know what to click, and things just become too complicated there, and it becomes more of a session where we're trying to get them on the game rather than actually doing the game. So it's just a thing to keep in mind for people who are planning to go that route. And I've also been doing such things as like trivia game or game show type things. Like I found a few Jeopardy templates online and just kind of use those. Those have been going really good as well. And a lot of other like mindful conversation things like show and tell, where I have the kids just kind of go get something from their house that means a lot to them and then they explain how much it means to them. Those have been doing well also. So those are just a few examples of the things we've been doing, and hopefully that can be a good idea for others to follow.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank you, Jeremy. Charlene, are you able to expand on that a little bit? I'm really curious about how your 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens is going. That's a fantastic program and I love it. The reason I'm curious is I have been doing all my programming online, and I had said to Lisa last week that I feel like I have a better connection with my kids facilitating these programs online than I did standing in front of them in the classroom. I have more interaction, I have more questions, and I just love it and am having a really great time. And I don't know if it's because I've been fortunate and they're all on their own Chromebooks. They all get to talk to me. They all get to see me. It's completely different and far better than I ever expected. However, I haven't done any older kiddos. I'm starting that in a couple of weeks. And so I'd like to know how it's going with your grade 10 kids. If you could fill me in on that, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I do the younger kids too. And I do definitely have more interaction with the younger kids. They get really involved. But the older kids, it's the same thing. They're all on their own separate Chromebooks. They're in the classroom together, but they all log in individually. I've only done 2 sessions so far, and I'm winging it as I go. I'm developing it as I go.
Totally understand that.
Yeah. I have a really good teacher in the classroom, and he does a lot of that, I guess, like physical engagement piece for me. So if I ask a question and it's crickets, then he fills in with, more encouragement, or he knows the kids better to ask, a specific kid their thoughts on it or that kind of thing. The first session I did, they all had their cameras turned off. So I was telling the girls here, it was like I was just reciting a speech.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And I gave the teacher that feedback. And so he had them have all their cameras on the second time. And I had some kids nodding and smiling and engaging. And then I had kids with their toques pulled down over their faces. Yeah. And, but I think it's going really well. We're pretty much in the beginning stages of it. The biggest issue I think we're going to have is we're scheduled on Fridays. And so our 8-week course is going to take right until the end of the school year to actually complete, because we get bumped so many times for Fridays off. And I'm a little worried about how that's going to affect the continuity of the material.
Right. And so, Charlene, you said that you can see them all nodding and you can see all their faces. And do you agree? Do you think that you have a little bit more buy-in facilitating programs this way?
I can't actually speak to that because I'm fairly new to the position. So I've not taught in a school setting before.
Okay.
So To be honest, I don't know. I do find with the younger kids that the issue I'm having with them in a Zoom setting versus a physical setting is they often need help with things, and I'm not physically there to help them if we're doing a craft or we're trying to find something in the book.
Okay.
Or not, right? I can't walk around the classroom and assist them. So I'm trying to talk these guys through.
So that's where I've been very fortunate with some of my younger kids, like my kindergarten class. That was just, I was just shared on a laptop, and then one session she had the kids paired up onto 3 separate Chromebooks. All of my other classes, like I said, I've been fairly fortunate. They've all been on Chromebooks individually, but my younger ones where I did have handouts and stuff, my teachers have been amazing for helping me facilitate that and, you know, writing things down on the board as we go.
My book club, they're doing it at home. So some of them are doing it, they're coming in, they've got an older sibling babysitting them who's not that interested in sitting through book club to help them with things, or mom is busy with other things. So I have had, you know, at least one instance where I've resorted to, can you just go find mom? Because I think you need a little extra help, and no matter how many times I show you how to do this origami fold, you're just not getting it, kind of thing. So yeah, I haven't had the younger kids in the classroom, but yeah, the older kids with the teacher dynamic, a good teacher partner, I think works really well, who's not just kind of turning it on and walking away. He's actively engaged. He reiterates what I say, he builds on it. He relates it back to their other subject content, and is using it to build on the other things that they've already done throughout the year.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for sharing, Charlene.
You're welcome.
If I could just share it, it's Barb from Bentley.
Hi, Barb.
Finished our 3rd session of our baking by Zoom with some kiddos who were like 11, 12. And we did it on PD days, and we provided them with a kit with all of the supplies, and we Zoomed with them in the morning and put the bread together, had great conversations up to the point where it was ready to rise. And then we took a break and they cleaned up and logged back on with us when their bread was ready to punch down and go to the next steps. And then again, we logged off and then logged back on later after the bread was cooked to have a look at their finished results. And it was called Learn, Bake, and Share. Quite successful. We only had 4 kids to start with to try it, but it was very interesting to teach them how to cook over Zoom.
There's been a few of the baking programs going on. I know the rec department here is doing those as well. And I think they've been a huge hit to get the kids engaged in, and they just seem to love them after school.
Sorry, Amanda, which community are you from?
FCSS in Valley View.
In Valley View, thank you.
And so Lisa had posted a question here. Are there any challenges FCSS programs are facing to gather outcomes for virtual programming? So are you guys getting outcomes doing these programs virtually? How is that going for you? I know that for myself, because our teachers are so busy, once I send in my post tests and my surveys, because I don't spend the time with the kids in class to go through them with them and collect them, I have the teachers do them. So then it just takes that extra time for them to do it with the students and then get them scanned and emailed back to me. I've had it's taken me longer to get my outcomes from them. Anybody else?
We are just going to be actually phoning the parents and asking them, since we just have a small amount of youth participating right now. So.
Okay.
I had to provide some sort of incentive for my surveys. So if they filled out the survey via Google Docs, Google Polls, whatever it's called, Then at the end, I had an optional field where they provided their mailing address, and then I literally mailed them just like a small like thing of slime or something like that, just as a thank you for participating.
Rebecca, were these programs that you were facilitating in the school or outside of school time?
Outside of school.
Okay. Oh, Sandra used SurveyMonkey and it worked well. Yes, and so that's it. Like we do our pre and post surveys, brought paper to the schools and picked it up later. And see, with all my programming, all my school programming, every week I email the teachers their handouts that the students are going to need, so they can still go ahead and create the folders and the little booklets that I would normally bring to them. And the teachers have been really absolutely amazing. They don't have a problem doing the photocopying. My Home Alone program has a lot of specifically colored sheets, and I had apologized to my teacher, and of course it's a big booklet, and she's no problem. They didn't have any problem doing the photocopying and preparing it for the students, because of course anything that we bring in has to be on hold for so many days and in quarantine. So it's been wonderful. And I haven't picked up the school copies. I've just had them scan them to me, but I'm glad that you got some surveys back, Sandra.
I just also want to say that when I went in and I would do SurveyMonkey, when I would like work with the schools and stuff, I never left the SurveyMonkeys till I was done the program and just left it for them to do later. I actually stopped the program before, like 10 minutes before we ended, and I gave them time to do them while I was still there. And then I ended it later, because then it's almost like they know that that's what that time is for. They take it.
Right. And normally when I'm in the classroom, like I usually have 15-20 minutes at the very end of my session where we go through our post test together, and then I can take them and I know I have them to do my outcomes with. So it has been a little bit challenging. I'm like I said, I'm still waiting for a couple of teachers, and the hard thing is that you don't want to just keep emailing and bugging them, right? Because we all know they have so much on their plates right now. That is definitely a struggle. I'm going to look up SurveyMonkey and see how to go about doing that. So you just took your outcomes from the chat, Ada? And just asked in the chat and it worked well. Okay.
There are polls on Zoom. I suppose you could go that route.
Yeah. I had kind of thought about that too. Do surveys for free. Well, of course, yeah. And I mean, because we already have our post tests for all of our FCSS programs, so, you know, to get our outcomes, you certainly could transfer that information to a Zoom poll or to a survey online. I'm sure that would work just as well. Anything else anybody wants to share? Anything wonderful, fabulous new things that they've discovered in the last month? Well, we got a quiet group again today.
I did a Bob Ross paint night with my youth last week. It was very fun. I had a small group, and it was a lot of prep for me because I had to like pre-prepare all these packages for them to like curbside pickup ahead of time, and then I'm arranging pickup times, and it's way more work, but I do think that it was worth it. The youth really enjoyed it, and they all have a lot of pride in their painting, so that was pretty awesome.
that's great. What age group did you do, Rebecca?
I opened it up for all teens, so 13 to 17.
And how many did you have? How many kids did you have?
I only created 10 packages because it was my first time doing it, and actually it is a little bit pricier because you have to buy all these paint brushes, and then they get to keep them. They get to you don't get to reuse any of these materials, the big canvases, everything. So it was pretty expensive, but it I'd say was worth it. The downfall is obviously, with that expense, I don't get to do it as frequently, and it's also very time consuming. So in that regard, I don't get to do it as frequently either, but it was just a fun special event type of thing.
Good. Awesome. Teresa asked if anybody is doing any in-person programming. I have one coming up, Teresa, in April. My goodness, which is like what, 3 days away? And I was quite surprised by it because I had a teacher contact me, wanted me to come in and do the Home Alone program, and she had said virtually or otherwise. And when I emailed her back, I'm like, what does or otherwise mean? Am I allowed in your school? Because here in Valley View, the school division is not allowing outsiders in, so it has to be. But in this other school division, they are. And she said, no, you can absolutely come into the school. And I'm pretty excited about it. And of course, doing Home Alone in the school, it's an all-day thing now. I'm excited, but I'm nervous because we haven't seen the kiddos for so long, right? Like we're so used to just kind of being in our office, and I don't know, there's some sort of weird comfort here that we're used to now. So is all your programming in person, Teresa? But not in school. Okay, I see what you mean. Right. And primarily, like the programming that I do, it is in the schools, the programming that I do. Like we don't do any rec programming or anything like that. So my target is to get into the schools. Oh, can anybody answer Elisa's question there? Anyone that works outside of schools with teens 12 to 18, how do you reach them? What methods work best to communicate with them, get their interest? It's hard to get the older teens' interest. Does anybody have any advice there?
I could comment on that. We're lucky in Lac-La-Biche because our office is right next door to the high school. So, and it's, there's only 2 high schools in town. So almost every age, 13 to 17 or 18-year-old is next door to us. So of course with COVID, it has been more of a challenge, but I find, especially non-COVID world, the face-to-face, the actual chit-chatting. Of course, we do have the opportunity to do that just in the hallways here because they come over here for lunch to the cafeteria and everything. But we got a really good relationship as well with the high school. So if it wasn't for COVID, I could wander over there, sign in or wave at the lady at the front and just go over at lunch, go over at breaks, and just honestly probably be annoying to some people, but the teens seem really, they seem to really respond well to kind of just chit-chatting with them. And hey, this Friday we're doing this. Want me to sign you up? Have a piece of paper with me, sign their names, and kind of worry about the paperwork stuff a little later, but just trying to get them on the spot. Emails to parents, we do that, quite a bit of that. I can't say like it works for some parents, doesn't work for other parents. Texting parents, I find that to be, it gets very time consuming and very, it takes a lot of time to answer questions and stuff, but we do it. And I know all of us do it in our FCSS, take that time and really foster those one-on-one relationships with families. Try to find out more about their families. Do they have younger siblings, older siblings? Just really taking the time to really make these connections. But we are in a small town, so everybody knows everybody anyway. So it can be tricky though. An ad in the local newspaper is not going to reach a 15-year-old, right? So yeah, I haven't gone to the point of, we're on Facebook, but I don't do Instagram or the other stuff, but I think that would probably be an avenue that would work as well. but we do get numbers for sure in Lac-La-Biche for that age group for sure. So it's working well.
Excellent. Thank you, Christine. Emma says they do all of their advertising in the schools. And so Melody asked how they got permission. And Christine, you can tell me if I'm wrong or not. During the summer, I was moved over to our rec department. And when we were trying to run programs over there, we were following AHS's guidelines for like day camps and activities. And within their parameters, like you could have 10 people per facilitator. And of course, we had to follow all the COVID guidelines and everything. So when you're running the programs outside of the schools, following AHS guidelines is different than if we were following them in the school, right? Correct? Because of course,
sorry, I think were you asking me? Sorry, yeah.
Well, I'm just saying, like,
yeah.
Right now for me, I'm not allowed in the school because of the school division, not necessarily because of AHS.
Yeah, and I don't go to the schools right now either. Yeah, so it is a separate thing, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
And so for ours, yeah, it was a bit of a struggle. You know, it was yes and then no, and then, you know, the municipality has rules too. So in the end, they decide if you can use their community hall for something or not, right? So it was not much can run here, to be honest with you. It has to be youth. It has to be a certificate program, they say.
Okay.
I'll be honest, it's very confusing. And even our own Alberta Health Services person's confused, you know, and she'll say that. She'll say, geez, you know, and then it's a kind of a back and forth of, is it even their decision, or does it come down to the CAO of Lac-La-Biche County that says you can use it or not, you know? So I just ran the 3 that I could in that brief window. I don't know if I can do any more or not, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there, I think. But
right. And
then sometimes it's like, if you can only have 9 kids anyway, like it's better than nothing. But when you got 20 some kids on the list for a learner's course, it's kind of, it's tricky too, right? But
exactly, yeah.
So it's almost like, and I can't do it 4 times, you know, that's getting a little crazy, you know, so it's tough.
Well, and that's the same last year when I did Home Alone at the multiplex, and whereas normally we would hit every grade 4 classroom and do it as a class, I could only have those 10 kids in there. So, you know, you have to do it so many times to reach everybody. So that was a little difficult as well. This summer, we are planning to run our life skills. We're going to run life skills day camp. We've got 5 weeks of them planned, 3 days each. And if everything stays, I mean, we all know our rules are going to change and everything, but we will be following AHS's guidelines to do those programs, and we will be running them out of our community halls and stuff like that. So we're looking forward to that, but the challenges of it are going to be quite a few, I think. I'm just getting caught up on the chat. You guys are. Start in-person programs in your youth center April 12th. That is exciting. Safety protocol. So Krista, the programming that you're going to start on April, what types of programs are you running?
So we're going to be running our after school program again. We've chatted lots with our AHS public health officer, but also their AHS daycare childcare lead. And they have let us know that even unlicensed drop-in type after school programs are able to run. With, of course, some limits and things like that put in place. So we will be starting up our after school program. It will not be drop-in as it has been in the past. It will be a pre-registered and limits very limited numbers, but we will be able to operate that every day after school, and it has to be the same cohort. That's the only other thing, is that we can't have different kids day to day. It has to be the same. So we're going to, we can have up to 30 kids, but we just staffing wise have decided to keep the numbers down to 12. So we'll see the same 12 kids every day until June when the program is over. And the other thing we're doing as well is we're running teen support programs in the evening, face-to-face, because support programs, mutual peer support programs can operate under AHS guidelines. And so we're running a stress and anxiety group for teens in person starting April 12th as well.
Do you have kids pre-registered for that already?
Not yet. We have been kind of waiting as our community program guide is coming out this week. So it will be announced this week that program will be open to register. I think registration opens on Wednesday or Thursday this week.
Okay.
We'll see how many we get.
Yeah, like that's our struggle, is trying to have, like, when we facilitate out of the schools, like our school liaison can say, okay, this kid, they really need this program. Let's kind of put them in. But when we're doing after school programs, it's so difficult to reach those kiddos that we know need it, right? Because they're not willing to sign themselves up. I'm curious to see what you get for numbers. I hope it's great.
Yeah, well, I'm sure what will likely happen. So our teen coordinator will reach out. We have been doing one-on-ones for several months now, where we can meet with kids one-on-one in the youth center, or we're also doing in-school programs. So we've created some of those relationships. So we'll let those kids know first. Hey, there's this program. How can we help support you in getting registered so that we can see you in the youth center, and it will probably take us reaching out to their parents and doing some of that online registration for them and with their help. But there is a COVID waiver that needs to be signed. It's a little bit more of a process than we're used to for sure. But yeah, I'm hoping with the teen support programs, we can only have up to 6 kids in that program. So we're going to run two 5-week sessions between now and the end of June.
Okay. And that's the one for stressing and anxiety?
Yeah, it's called Stress Busters. And so it's a program that we already facilitate in the schools along with our community helpers, suicide prevention, mental health promotion program. So we already do that program in the schools, but this is just, it's going to kind of help those kids who maybe need a little extra support through that.
Right. Excellent. So actually, what you mentioned, Stress Busters, I have just been doing I had done a course on domestic violence, and they had recommended the, what is it called? The 4 R's. And so is anybody familiar with the HRPP program, so Healthy Relationships Plus program? Has anybody ever ran that? I've been doing some research on it, and it looks really incredible. So it's the 4R Healthy Relationship Plus program. You can look up their website. I'll put it on the chat for you guys. Nobody's heard of it yet, hey?
I have had some staff take that training in the past. It always seems to be, I give the staff the training and then they leave. So I don't have any current staff who are trained in it. However, it is a really great training for sure. It's really in depth and really great at building those relationships. I think you could even take pieces of it and really implement it into other programs as well. You don't have to run it as a standalone program.
So Amanda, can you hear me? Okay. So about 6 years ago, I was pretty heavily involved in trying to get the 4th R in our schools. And basically at that point in time, and I don't want to give any false information because things could have changed, but the fourth R, the fourth R stands for relationship, right? And basically the Minister of Education at that time had allowed that the whole curriculum to be a part of the school. So what my job was to talk to these school divisions and say, hey, let's get this fourth R in the health program. And not one of the school divisions that we work with were ready to do it. And it wasn't something that a youth facilitator from FCSS could just go in and do the whole fourth R curriculum. It was like a teacher who had to do it in place of their regular health curriculum. So while I appreciate the point that you could pick and choose some things from that and put it in some of our other programs like skills or kiddo, you know, which is knowing the issues, discussing the options, it's not something that in Greenview it really got uptake on, which was super disappointing. Having said that, myself and a couple of other key players in the community did a fourth R training with some of the school staff, but that's as far as it went.
Right. And like there's different programs, and I'm not sure if it's like they do have the grade 7, 8, 9 curriculum programs that they would like to see into the schools that follows the health curriculum. And then they have this other one, the HRPP, that is for facilitators like us to go in and facilitate. And I'm not sure if that's a new program or not. Like I said, I just got this information and I was just checking to see if anybody else was familiar with it. And the training you just do online through their website as well. So something new to look at. Teresa, I use the Canadian Red Cross Healthy Youth Relationships. I use that quite a bit in my programs.
There's also the developmental relationships training that the Search Institute out of the States does. Quite a few of my staff have taken that training, and we're actually going to be running our first Keep Connected program starting this week night. Actually, is our first virtual Keep Connected program, and that is a family program that teaches developmental relationships and helps to build those positive relationships between preteens, early teens, and their parents. And we're offering a free meal with each of those programs too, because that's a big part of that program. And so we're working with local businesses and they'll just have takeout instead of having that usual family meal we would have together in person. But yeah, we have 3 families signed up for it, and I thought that was pretty good for our first virtual attempt at it. So I can let you know how that goes next time.
For sure. What's the program called, Krista?
It's called Keep Connected, and it's through the Search Institute in the States. And right now I have 3 staff trained in it. We had some funding through Alberta Health Services that allowed us to pay for that training. So through addiction prevention.
Okay, excellent. We'll look that up. Okay. Any last minute questions in the group here? Oh, Krista, how much was the training?
Yeah, it's pricey. I'm trying to think how much it was. I want to say because it's a co-facilitated program, you have to have 2 trainers. So I think it was like $650, and it was over $1,000, and that's US. Okay. For 2 people to get the training. So yeah, like I said, we had some funding that we weren't able to use the way we wanted to, just because of COVID. And so AHS allowed us to use the funding to do the Keep Connected training. So we have actually we have 4 staff. We have 2 FRN staff and 2 FCSS staff trained in it.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Emma.
Yeah, there you go.
Perfect. Awesome. Janice, I'm sure you heard us, but the Canadian Red Cross does have a really good healthy youth relationship program as well. If you're not familiar with it, you can look it up. It's great. All right. Does anybody have any topics they would like to cover for our next meeting? I think the general consensus was that we loved Mike's presentation. Agreed? Yeah. Awesome. Good. I'm glad to hear that. Well, if you guys have any other ideas on a presentation maybe that we could bring to you again, make sure
I just have a question, I guess, maybe about people's thoughts with Mike's presentation. As I was sitting there listening, I think, I've been to a few trainings like this, and I'm like, yep, you're preaching to the choir. yeah, like I always learn something more, but we have our youth group in town, our youth coalition called Impact, last year proclaimed Pride Week in our community. It was the first time that ever happened. So that was very cool. And so we're trying to think of some things that we could do to help celebrate Pride. So there's Pride Month in June, and there's Pride Week in August. And I would love to put on a presentation, but does anybody have any ideas or thoughts about how do you get those people who maybe need to hear those messages that maybe they don't know because they just, they're not, we live and work in that field and deal with those types of kids and families all the time. But what about just to try to create some of that community change and some, because even things like, asking to fly a pride flag in our community becomes a very big process. Mm-hmm. And I think it really comes down to people's understanding and just, I think sometimes people are a little bit fearful about learning. So any ideas or thoughts about how we can be more inclusive community and getting that message out to our community?
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I had messaged Mike and asked him on how we could bring this into our community. And that was the question that he said was better answered through an email or a phone call. So because I was thinking the exact same thing. We've talked about having a GSA for our, high school kids. And I honestly don't know how to make it acceptable or make it however, like in our community, right?
Yeah, I was even thinking around like, how can I approach like our HR director, for example, in our municipality and be like, I feel like this is a good training for all staff, because it needs to start from within. Mm-hmm. So if we as a staff, and it's not just FCSS's job to know about these things, but as community members, as people who are public servants within our community, that this is something we should all be aware of. And how do I approach that subject? And if I'm just wondering, I guess, and I can definitely reach out to Mike too, if he's done this training for other municipalities, not so much people just working in the social services field, but for people who are just, your everyday Joe, like the guy in planning and development, the public works person, how do we get that information to them? So yeah, I'm just interested to know if he's ever done that before.
Well, maybe we, I can touch base with Mike and see if he can provide us with some more precise training on that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we could have him back for that.
Yeah, no, that would be really great, because I just feel like, you know, it's the same people hear those messages, and that's great. Again, I always learn something different every time I hear.
Yeah.
But how do we reach those unreachables? I mean, that's always the question for us, I think.
Everything that we do, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree completely.
Mm-hmm.
How to get our leaders comfortable with those in the community who are
Absolutely, even that, right? Like
Yeah.
they were very open to it, the proclamation, which was really fantastic. But again, you know, in order for us at the youth center to fly a flag, there had to be a protocol. There had to be a whole lot of process involved in that. There's just, again, there's all this worry of community backlash. So that just tells me that the community needs to be more knowledgeable.
Yeah.
I wonder, one of the things that resonated with me today as well, Krista, and I thought, I actually asked Mike the same question. So he did send me something. He said he hasn't done a particular presentation on it, but he does have an article, because one of the things that we talked about, and this is just not within this role, but in another role, they're resistant to putting pronouns and stuff like that. And I think one thing that I really heard today was the benefits of having more inclusive language and how it reduces risks for certain populations. And I think, what's the business case? I always think like,
Right.
what's going to make the impact for who the audience that we're talking to, right? So if it's we're going to see potentially less suicides in our school and address mental health issues in our school, like those kinds of things. I think, how do we speak to that audience? And I'm definitely not an expert in this, that's for sure. And Mike says he hasn't done a specific presentation on it, but he might be able to build something custom if that's something we're looking for.
Oh, that'd be awesome. Exactly. I hear what you're saying about creating that business case. We had to do the same thing when we approached our municipality about all staff getting mental health and suicide prevention training, and we had to kind of make the business case for it. So we can definitely, I would love to work with him on helping to develop that business case a little bit, so that I can approach our municipality about it.
Okay, well, I will, we'll get in touch with Mike and see if we can find some more information out from him, and possibly bring him back for some more education. I think that would be great. Any final words there, Lisa?
No, I don't think so. Other than I'm glad that we had the opportunity to ask all of the youth coordinators, you know, if there is another topic. Also, I don't mind, like, of course, we'll work with Melissa to get Mike back if that's what we want. But I just wanted to make sure too that, because when we originally started, the doodle poll thought that we would have 4 sessions. So we do have 1 more scheduled next month. And I just wanted to make sure that there's still interest of having another one, and to make sure that it's worth everybody's while. So what happens sometimes is we ask these questions, and then you know, people forget about it until next time. So I'd really encourage you, if there is any guest speakers or topics that you want, we'll do it. And then so Melissa's just put up this poll, so that's great. Please fill it out just to make sure we are, you know, spending our time valuably. So yeah, so maybe we can see that, and if you can type in the chat, yeah, we want Mike back to start a GSA, or, you know, ideas. I would say not particularly, but I mean, let's face it, in the rural communities, it's going to be tough. That's how he started his presentation. And I just want to say, like, too, that one that Ruth is doing, some online sessions, I think in a way that's brilliant, because people might have more safety to come in and online as opposed to showing up in a community hall or classroom. Other than that, I don't really have anything more to say. Oh, look at that. Everybody wants one. Awesome.
That's great. So then April 26th is our next meeting.
Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll go for April 26th, and if we can, if Mike can do something for us, we may extend the invitation out, because I think to create change in the community, obviously we need some, maybe more directors in on the session too. I don't know. But if Mike can't, if there's another topic, I think that was a great session today. Yeah, just let me know or let Amanda know, and we'll make it happen.
Sure, and we might even, if it's okay, Ruth, we might even put you on the spot next time to let us know how those online sessions went for you.
Hey, Ruth here. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
I think she's trying to.
Pardon?
We can't hear you, Ruth.
Can you hear me better now?
There,
Yeah.
now we can hear you.
The mic on my computer is really bad. I've been having a lot of issues with it. But I was saying, as to Krista's question, last year I wanted to do something pride related or like inclusive of that community. And I was getting a lot of just walls, and I wasn't really able to do anything. But this year I lead our like youth leadership group or youth council, and we're doing it as part of our youth council's kind of youth week. And so I find getting the youth with me, behind me, to kind of get some of these initiatives started is helpful, because it's coming from them versus just from me. So that was helpful. And actually my HR department has been really receptive. The facilitator I have coming out to do my 2 sessions, he also does corporate training. And my HR department's really receptive about bringing him in to do some training for the municipality staff as well. But they just want me to vet him. So I have to watch your presentations and get back to them about how it is. And then they will allow me to bring it in for some staff training. So all they did was really ask, and they were really receptive about it. So that was awesome. But yeah, I will update you all after next month.
All right.
Excellent, thank you. All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm glad that everybody still loves this and appreciates it. You guys have a wonderful, wonderful week and a wonderful Easter break.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.